Welcome to Next in Nonprofits. I'm Steve Boland, and I am very pleased to be joined today by Dr. Lindsay Whorton. She is the president of the Holdsworth Center, and very excited to have you here today. Lindsay, thanks so much for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
For those that may not be familiar with the work of the Holdsworth Center, could you begin by just kind of helping us understand your mission there and what you do?
Sure. So we are a nonprofit that has been around since 2017, based in Austin, Texas. And our focus is pre-K through 12 public education across the state. And I would argue, that anybody who's working in the space of public education fundamentally has a shared mission. We might talk about it in slightly different ways, but it's to improve the outcomes and the opportunities for the students who our schools serve. And in Texas, that's around 5.5 million kids. The
Ooh.
question for nonprofits is, what role do we play, in that mission? And for us, we've really focused in on one really specific contribution to that mission, which is how do we build strong leadership for our schools and districts across the state? So we are fundamentally focused on the people. There are many things that need to be true for kids to get a great education, but we are kind of based on the belief that the foundation of a strong public education system is excellent teachers, excellent principals, excellent superintendents. And so we run a variety of programs. You can think of us kind of like we have a physical facility in Austin. We host leaders for really intensive leadership development experiences that some people have kind of compared to like an executive MBA in its duration and its intensity. But everything we do is trying to identify, develop, encourage, and support the leaders who our students count on to get a great education in the state of Texas.
And we got connected to think a little bit more about such big missions, such big impact kinds of ideas work within systems. They work within larger systems. And while everyone would love to be able to turn results on a dime in something like that, impacting change at at scale can be really difficult. So before we get into, how your work is, trying to turn the battleship of systems change within education and whatnot, can you just talk a little bit about your experience with having to operate within a larger scale system to get your work done?
Yeah, I think a few thoughts to get us started. Probably each of these is like a 2 hour, conversation. One thing that's really important to me when I think about public schools is really thinking about what's my role as a nonprofit organization that sits outside of the school and the district, which is the centerpiece of how we deliver a great education. Like, what's my role in this contribution? And one thing we've tried to be true is like we are one trying to build this system of leadership development that will influence kind of the human capital that's available in our schools. But we also partner, with schools and districts to try to help them, improve and change the system. And I think as a nonprofit, we try to operate with an appropriate humility about what our role is, because fundamentally, it's the superintendent who is responsible in partnership with their school board to their community for making all of the decisions and frankly pulling all the levers that fundamentally will influence how students are served. And we try to recognize that we are not the school district, and it is not our job to come in and try to dictate to the superintendent and their board who knows their community best exactly what you should do in every community to change student achievement. We try to get really clear on what do we know really well, what skills and capabilities do we have to offer that can enhance, that can complement, that can supplement what those communities are trying to do. And for us, we stay really hyper focused on the people questions. How do you, as a system, identify great principals and superintendents? How do you have leaders that encourage and equip your teachers and allow great people to come into and stay in the classroom? And because I think we have a really specific focus, it allows us to really focus on how we can be of service in helping those systems drive big change, but also have an appropriate humility about our role in interacting with fundamentally like a democratic civic institution, And so we
Mhm.
try to strike that balance in how we work with them.
So thinking about, the community down to the elementary school level, my local institution blocks from my house that I see kids every day. I do think that the challenge with a lot of nonprofit organizations, education certainly being a prime example, is folks thinking, well, I don't think this is going as well as it could.
Mm,
How come that isn't changed tomorrow? Why doesn't that,
yeah.
end up getting fixed? We know there's problems. We have a standardized test score, for example, and last year the standardized test score told us something different from the year before, and that indicates something. Getting from this input from community to the systemic shifts invariably takes some amount of time that somebody's unhappy with. How do you start communicating around the timeframes you have to work in to get the kinds of changes you're talking about?
Yeah. One thing that I just have to say because it's so important to me is I always want to lead in by saying it is very important for us to acknowledge that there are magical things happening for kids in public schools in every community, in every state across the country. And we don't talk about those things enough. And of course, there is so much work to do to give every kid the opportunity that we deserve, and that's what we spend all our time on. But
Yeah.
I never want to hone in on those opportunities for improvement without acknowledging that there's like so much good work, to
Mhm.
celebrate. Um, I think the fundamental tension that you're pointing out is, I mean, particularly when we're talking about our kids, I mean, one of the things you'll hear people say is like this student, my child, whether it's a child who lives in my home, whether it's my neighbor down the street, they only get one shot at third grade or they only get one shot at fifth grade. And that's true. And I think that that is why we have such a extraordinary sense of urgency to try to get things right for our kids because it is just fundamentally unfair. For us to not do that and to leave them with less of the skills and opportunities that they need to have a great life. And I think that if you're a superintendent, a principal, an educational leader, you have to operate, with that kind of sense of
Mhm.
urgency. And I think this is a paradox because the other thing that is true is that there are investments that we need to make in our public institutions in order over the long term to give them a real opportunity to grow, improve, get better, and get the kind of results that we want. And so I always think about this as a both and. I think we can make a mistake when we say either this is only about short-term gains, and we're only going to focus on or consider interventions that will move the needle on test scores in 6 or 12 months. That's all we're going to do. That's a mistake. That's not going to build
Mhm.
the kind of organization that you want to have. It's not going to help you really get to your dreams, for the system. But it also would be a mistake to say we're going to completely ignore the short-term actions that we need to take to achieve results. And so you've got to have that balance, which is to say, yeah, we've got to identify, in our system, the 3 to 5 things that we're going to do to move the needle for kids today. But somebody also has to be asking, what are the investments that we should be making right now that are going to put us in a dramatically different place 3, 5, 10 years from now? And for me, human capital is in that second category. And so I think the challenge as we communicate is to not try to create some sort of either or situation because it's a bad choice to either pick short term or long term.
Mhm.
And I believe nonprofits can exist, should exist to make some of those longer term investments that our public systems don't always have the resources to prioritize. So that's how we think about our work and try to communicate about it.
Yeah, it's tough in the work that you're talking about in education, but it also so many other fields. I mean, if you go into many denser urban areas and see a really difficult homelessness problem, people on the streets not having access, you're thinking, why haven't we done something about this already? And some of those solutions are, well, we should be building more housing. And even if the money was already dedicated, that doesn't happen quickly. It's those kinds of, there are things that have to happen in a process for systems to pick up things. And in the meantime, that situation of this shouldn't be happening this way just feels so difficult and hard, I think, sometimes to focus on, well, what we need is a 5-year plan to put money together for a infrastructure for a whatever. It's got to be difficult to communicate that to charitable stakeholders sometimes. I was particularly interested to talk with you about the interaction in government stakeholders and the kind of charitable sector work and whether you see different tolerances for that conversation at those different levels? Do foundation people talk to you differently from, folks that are looking at bonding through taxpayers? I mean, how does
Hmm.
that play out?
I'm going to be so curious what you're seeing about this, because one of the,
Hmm.
I have a very specific vantage point. One organization really focused on Texas, very
Right.
unique, and you must have such a broad perspective in all the folks that you talk to. Uh, our experience is, and we have a lot more, we spend a lot more of our time interacting with foundations
Hmm.
than we do with government funding or government grants. Um, my observation is that I think you have different funders who have different time horizons. I mean, just to put it very simply, and I think there are some folks, whether they're individual philanthropists or kind of institutional foundations, corporations, who their philosophy is really about those short-term gains. And I'm not convinced in the short term, if that's your strategy, that I'm going to be wildly successful at
Right.
convincing you to invest in talent. I'm still going to have the conversation because I think that conversation is an investment in the future and how you might think about your strategy in the future. But once somebody's locked in and really said, these are the metrics that I'm trying to move, and I'm trying to move this metric in the next 3 years, the way I operate is I'm not going to tell a story about how I'm going to move that metric if I don't believe my intervention can get to that detail that quickly. And so for me, I think the work is finding the people who have the time horizon, but I think there are other funders who think longer term and are willing
Hmm.
to make those bigger bets. And for us, also funders who just have a fundamental appreciation about how important the people side of the equation is, in our situation. And so I think the first step is to just try to get clear on kind of mapping out where are people. And then being honest with yourself about whose strategy matches yours, and then trying to invest most of your time and energy in those places while recognizing that those other conversations are about cultivating, thinking for the future. So that's what I observe. I don't know if I have a clear point of view at this moment. I don't think I can speak definitively on what the mix is right now or what direction it's changing. I think the only thing I feel confident about is in education, and I would guess this is true in other fields. Technology is so alluring because it promises scale and speed in a way that almost no other intervention does. And so I do think philanthropists are really drawn to all these new technologies that offer these really bold promises about how you can change systems at scale, through AI and through other things. And so I think those of us who have longer term strategies focused on people, focused on some of these more complex systems. I think there's like a new communication challenge that we have to take on to explain how to think about this kind of investment in contrast to kind of the simplicity, the scale, and the speed of technology.
Well, to just address your comment a moment ago about other sectors outside of education or Texas that may be more open or less open, I do think that there's generally accepted wisdom out there about the impact of changing a system, and sometimes the acknowledgement that we're just not going to do it anyway. I do think if you look at just the financial impact of, but going back to the crisis around housing, that the clear data-driven answer to how do we most cost effectively deal with this crisis is to just give every one of those people a free place to live.
Hmm.
That's the best investment that we could possibly make. And then politically, it goes nowhere because nobody wants to just give free housing away to folks that, haven't somehow earned it or are, whatever that might mean. And that's frustrating to think. The systemic change that needs to happen is the recognition that we are spending so much money imprisoning people, hospitalizing people, all the rest of it, that the much less expensive solution over the long term is absolutely to do the thing you don't want to do for other reasons. And
Mm,
that's
mm,
frustrating around a systems conversation, I think.
mm,
So I will throw that on the table
yeah.
as a challenge that I've seen sometimes. But I also think that there are some funders that are coming in saying, I want you to help me make that argument about the longer term thing. And I've heard from people saying, well, if we don't deal with today's issues, how can those funders, be ignoring this really critical need right now? I think you've addressed that a little bit with the conversation that you were just having about school board stuff, but this other piece of can you pull the best data-driven decision-making conversation, even if it does have some values alignment with the community, to say we don't want people to be homeless, we don't want to overspend on prisons, we don't want to overspend on emergency rooms. We all agree on those things. Therefore, solution, give people free housing, is like, nope, that's just a non-starter.
That dilemma seems to sit a little bit at the line that I didn't really get into, which
Mhm.
is where do some of these solutions really require policy change and
Yeah.
or kind of governmental investment, which is not our
Hmm.
focus as an organization. That seems to open a whole nother question, about the kind of political and policy questions that exist. But as you were talking, the reflection that I had, a mentor of mine, I had a wonderful first board chair who was a remarkable higher education leader, Ruth Simmons. She was at Brown, came to Prairie View after she finished there. I think, and she never said this to me directly, but I think one of the things that I always took away from listening to her talk about how you build support is I think it's just too easy to get trapped, and this is thinking more on the philanthropic side, into some sense that there's like a zero sum pie.
Right.
And that funders can either do X or they can do Y. And if you think about the number of funders that are practicing today, and who could come off the sidelines in some way. I mean, when you look at a pretty significant generational transfer of wealth that's happening right now,
Hmm.
it can be an and answer to a lot of these questions where and the question is how do you find and draw the people who can invest in kind of your contribution to the theory of action, and it doesn't have to be at the exclusion of all these other bets, and that's always an encouraging reminder to me because I think it's easy, maybe when you're getting the door shut in your face a little bit of finding some folks who are not connecting, with your value proposition to think, well, all of the energy is over here. And maybe that's true, but maybe there are other folks who have just not been activated yet. Who could come forward and start some new conversations. And so I think trying to avoid feeling like this is all zero sum and saying actually there's many ways to tackle these problems and we should probably pursue many of them at once. And the question for us is to how to find and or mobilize the people who could find energy, around this approach to solving the problem. I find to be a more encouraging way to think about building support.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. It's just it's a challenging space to be in. And when your team approached me about like, oh, this could be a good conversation for this audience, the framing was a little bit of like, how do you work within systems without trying to um, subsume them or make them your problem or whatever? And it's certainly a lot of nonprofits have to work within governmental systems in all kinds
Mhm.
of ways. If it's not, public education,
Mhm.
it's going to be around all kinds of other places that we have to think, systemically, it would be nice if our governmental partners were to do these things, but we're not going to try and subsume their responsibility. So how do you talk about those system change elements in partnership with organizations like government from a nonprofit perspective?
Yeah. And I'll go back to kind of where I opened, which is if you think about a school district and all the different things that need to happen for students to get a great opportunity, I think the way that we resolve that tension is to say it is not our job to try to become a shadow school district. It is not our job to try to dictate every single component of the organizational strategy. We have really picked one kind of key lever, one key area where we're going to focus, and we stay really, really disciplined about that. That's not everybody's strategy and approach. And I think one thing that I observe is I do think the conversation about systems change often pushes nonprofits in a very specific direction, which is you
Hmm.
start with a pretty specific focus and a kind of key capability, that you're trying to add to the conversation with like a clear goal, and the thing that your organization is going to be good at and going to be focused at. So for us, that's leadership development, it's human capital questions in education. But then you get started and you define specific goals and outcomes that are the most direct contribution, from that work. For us, that's things like leader retention. Do the people you develop, do they stay? Do principals lead teachers in ways that helps them get better, that allows them to stay in schools? And all of those things are a few clicks down from like the ultimate outcome that we care about, which is the indirect outcome, which is student achievement, student learning, student progress. And there's all these other factors that contribute. If we built kind of like a causal diagram, there'd be all these other lines with weights. We start there, we got clear goals. But then what happens is you feel this pressure to say, but you're only doing this part, and what about all of these other variables? And how are you going to change the system if you're not trying to influence all the things that
Yeah.
influence your outcome? And I think a lot of times it leads nonprofits to just continue to widen and widen and widen their scope and their strategy, to try to hit more of the variables that influence their outcome. And that can be a good strategy, can make sense in some contexts, but sometimes I think it results in you diluting your focus too broadly on things that you can't be good at all of them, and maybe you're not even appropriately positioned to be playing that role. And in our case, there's an elected school board. That's their job. That's their decisions to make. They appoint a superintendent, and so I think just being really clear-eyed about where setting a boundary around your mission, around your focus, and setting concrete goals that are measurable and maybe a little bit below your ultimate outcome is a good strategy, versus always feeling like expanding and consuming more um, makes you more systemic. I think that's a real tension to grapple with, and I see the kind of general expansion of a lot of people's strategies to sometimes be an unintended consequence of the way that we talk about and think about systems change.
So one of the more common tools people sometimes think about when trying to describe a long-term change is a logic model, a
Yeah.
theory of change that can be mapped out over time like that. Does it behoove the charity then to talk about partnerships or other organizations that may be hitting other areas of that whole system so that we can address that, that's legit. This other element of the system also needs to be going through some service and whatnot. We're going to focus over here on talent, but this partner over there focuses on, relationships with kids in homes and what their parents are getting for support. And this one's focusing on nutrition or whatever the other things may be. But is that too much to just even think about trying to map an ecosystem that is moving in the same direction?
I think that what you've described is fundamentally the logic of collective impact.
Mhm.
And so is certainly a strategy that I think a lot of local communities are trying to use to map and coordinate, these interdependent efforts. I think that makes a lot of sense. In our situation, we operate in a wide variety of local communities across the state. And I think my reflection would be, I think a logic model and a theory of action is a really important tool for being able to measure and evaluate your progress towards your goal. I'm not sure a logic model is always the best guide on how to communicate to your wide range of stakeholders about the importance of what you're doing. I think it leads us to communicate in really complicated ways about impact that I think makes it hard for people to understand what we're doing. And so I think trying to figure out how to simplify that logic and help it feel clear to people who care about what you're trying to do is important. And so for us, rather than trying to map out the entire logic model, the simpler version of the value proposition for us is something like research has made it very clear teachers are the very most important impact on student achievement. There are other things that matter, but teachers are the very most important thing. The second most important factor is having a great principal and great principals are the biggest influence on the quality and the retention of teachers. Therefore, there are many other things that matter for getting to
Hmm.
student achievement, but it is not unclear that having a great principal makes a huge difference to how our students are learning. Here's what we're doing to build great principals. And so I think making good choices about where that complexity helps us really measure what we're doing, hold ourselves accountable is important. But then also making choices about where we need to find simpler, more story-based ways of helping people understand why this specific thing that we're doing to contribute to the broader system is worth investing in.
It's a lot. So as you think about working with your primary constituencies, you mentioned you do talk to philanthropy a lot. Are they funding the work that you're doing with leadership and talent development and stuff because the school districts do not have dedicated resources in that space? Is that how that's been working?
Yeah. So I think investments in leadership development are so obvious in so many sectors. And we
Hmm.
interact with a lot of folks from the private sector who care about public education and are contemplating funding what we're doing. And most businesses that you talk about, they don't think twice, they don't blink about the idea that spending time, money, and energy cultivating the next generation of leaders is important to their business. But when we get into public institutions where resources are really scarce and there's a lot of scrutiny on them, it can be hard to mobilize a community around spending money on leadership development. And so it is one of those long-term investments that can make a big difference that is hard for this public institution to prioritize. And so a lot of our funders who we've worked with over many years, we have a number of foundations who really get why it matters for Texas to have a deep and high quality pool of educators and educational leaders. Just recognize that this is a unique role that philanthropy can play. Recognize how long-term and indirect the relationship between people development and student outcomes are, and have really come alongside and said, this is important. It's important to the future of the state. So yeah, that's what we found to be true.
So I've been really interested in following the long-term systems change theory around philanthropy itself.
Mm,
There are conversations right now about donor advised funds that are going underutilized that could be being put to work, and a lot of do we need regulatory change? Do we need some kind of philosophical adjustment in people's thinking?
mm,
What happens when Mackenzie Scott just throws a wrench in the works and says it doesn't have to be this way? Look at this completely other way of handling this.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
those those moments of thinking about are we working within philanthropy as in, please, I would like some funding for the next 2 years.
Yeah.
Maybe I can get 2 years worth instead of one, versus this whole system has to shift in order for our goals to be met. How are we helping them, with their own systems change work? Some of that is going to be a little bit about the value of the long term, but
Mhm,
others of it are a little bit around their own kind of incentives.
mhm.
So as you build relationships in philanthropy within education within Texas, do you see that kind of systemic change within your philanthropic partners as something that you can be engaged in?
Mm. I have so many questions about that about that lead in. My, my my first reflection is I giving away money well is really hard. Um, and so I do I think it's easy to get so focused on the way that it's hard to be an RC, trying to navigate um funders and their priorities. But I do have a lot of empathy for how difficult it is to try to figure out how to give money away in a way that produces the outcome that you care about. And so I think I kind of sit at the intersection of those two things that feel hard. And I think I see a lot of foundations in particular trying to experiment with different ways of thinking about funding,
Mhm.
whether it's trying to move towards longer term funding arrangements, where organizations can plan more. And I think there's a lot in that. I mean, one of the things I reflect on a lot, even as it comes to school districts, is when organizations really struggle to accurately forecast future revenues, it makes it really hard for them to put forward meaningful, coherent, and their best strategic thinking. And when you live on a year-to-year cycle, that really takes something away from what you can do. So I think that's a really interesting experiment.
Hmm.
I see a lot of foundations trying to be really mindful of how they make their grant making process as efficient and as effective as possible in terms of how much time it takes. Um, and think that's really commendable. I think foundations are trying to be mindful of the fact that not all nonprofits have the same amount of horsepower in terms
Hmm.
of, their ability to write and receive grants. And I think foundations really trying to not make this a competition about who has the best grant writer, but really allow people to bring forward, the best, clearest thinking on what they're trying to do. So I think I see a lot of really great efforts, and to your point about Mackenzie Scott, I mean, I think we're seeing a lot of new approaches and new experiments, and it'll be interesting to see where the field goes. The other thing that I'm noticing is I think there are more and more foundations trying to work together around their funding strategies, um, which I think for nonprofits probably has some positives and some trade-offs. The benefit is it's kind of like the collective impact example you gave before. More people trying to pool their resources to work together to move the needle in a common area. I think the challenge is as you have more foundations who cohere around a defined strategy, anybody who's outside of that struggles to
Yeah.
find traction. So I think that's a dynamic that I'm curious to see how that plays out across different fields.
Yeah, and I'll just throw a comment in about the world sometimes changing those perspectives, whether you wanted the world to do so or not. Having been through the COVID pandemic shifts in so many ways that impacted people's lives that systems of service, systems of funding service were not ready for and had to start thinking about, well, if we locked in everything on 4-year grant cycles before they're, how are we able to adapt to a big change like this? But I'm seeing more of it with different types of organizations post the second election of Donald Trump, where there's so many things that are happening at such a speed where it's like there used to be an NEA. Oh, no, there's not an NEA anymore. If you're an arts organization and you had been relying on that as something that was going to be there,
Yeah.
that speed of that kind of change was not built into systems that are designed to kind of adjust a little bit more slowly. So
Mm.
I do think that what you're raising about what if you were in this more locked in system and then you're not part of it? Somebody else is getting multi-year funding and this other thing is happening and this new thing emerges and you have to address it, but there's no way into a conversation with the folks that have traditionally done that. It's a really challenging space to be in. I don't know if you feel like your work, kind of fits that because education is something that's been such a part of the American story for so long. Do people see, your investment in talent as new, or is it just something that's evolving a system that's already been there? Is it easier to be new? Is it harder to be new?
Oh, our conversation around public education across the country I think, is in a really interesting moment.
Hmm.
And my sort of oversimplified version of that is in the late 90s, I think you started seeing a real energy around investing in what I would call like investing in innovation or investing in reform around public education. This was the charter movement. If you think about
Yeah.
Teach for America, you had a bunch of kind of big nonprofits come on the scene. And I think you had and you also have had a pretty bipartisan, politically coalition around public education for almost 30 years, and there were debates, but there was like a lot of consensus about what we should try in order to improve schools. And some of that was talent, there was a real focus on teachers, a little bit less on leadership. Some of that was about school options, school choice, and then there was a
Hmm.
variety of kind of other components. And my impression is that there were a lot of funders who invested a lot over a long period of time and have learned over the last 20 years how hard it is to get the results we care the most about, which is student achievement at scale. And so I think I perceive that we're in a moment where people are a little uncertain about where to go next, what to prioritize. I think technology is drawing like a little bit of attention. Um, but I think when it comes to the people part of the equation, I don't think anybody will argue with you about how important it is to have a great teacher, have a great principal. But I think um, the cost and the scale of those investments can feel really, really big, and it feels really, really hard um, to succeed and to move the needle. And so I think it's trying to figure out how do you convince people that it's doable and that you can make progress. It's something that's so big. But I do think the conversation around public schools is at a unique moment, and people are trying to figure out what do we need to focus on next and what can really kind of make that difference that we believe in for people to kind of come forward and make those big investments again.
So you're investing in leadership within the education sector as a, your mission, what you do. Do you think about that? What leaders are the right leaders at the right time for different challenges? Because I mean, I do wonder, is that extremely skilled, super experienced principal pre-COVID the same one that takes us through remote learning and the same one that has to then reintegrate people back into a classroom experience
Yeah.
a year and a half or two later? Or are those different skills? And how do we think through that systemic shift over time? That's such a challenging part of what's been happening in any kind of in-person service delivery setting in America in the last 7 years.
Yeah. There's a number of skills, characteristics, mindsets of leadership that I think are really foundational and true across almost any context. And so I think that's the kind of starting point, and some big blocks of things that we're always focused on are one, something we call personal leadership. So how do you stay anchored and get clear on your sense of purpose and what drives your leadership, because that becomes so critical to how you make decisions, when things get hard. Two, how do you manage yourself?
Mhm.
Because frankly, so much of your impact is about how you deal with what's going on in here and then how it comes out to everyone around you. So how do you regulate and manage your emotions in stressful and challenging environments? How do you maintain, your energy, your physical resources? I don't think we pay enough attention uh, in most sectors to the fact that you got to eat, you got to sleep, you got to exercise, and you got to build that in, to your routine, and all those other forms of energy. All that's personal leadership. It's the inside stuff. We think another big block is how do you lead other people? How do you
Mhm.
coach, develop, inspire the best in others? It's just foundational. I think there's no context of leadership where that is not important. There's no role, there's no context where that doesn't matter. And then how do you build teams and get people to work together towards a goal? And then our third big chunk, which has like different flavors and different roles, is leaders are always trying to figure out how to navigate and drive change in an organization. You're never sitting still. You should always be identifying, the right challenge and figuring out how you move people towards it. So I think those are some foundational pieces for us across everything we do. We have a big emphasis on how do we identify and develop future superintendents, which if you want to talk about like a really, really long-term indirect theory of action, it's like
Yeah.
finding an early career principal, helping them become a superintendent, and then measuring their impact on student achievement. Really, really hard to do. But if nobody's cultivating the next generation of superintendents, we are going to be in trouble in 10 or 15 years, because that job, to your point, is getting harder and harder, more and more complex, and in a lot of ways feels kind of scary. It's a really demanding job. You can be at the center of like a lot of conflict, in your
Yeah.
community. And so we've been thinking a lot about how that job is changing and then how we can identify and get people ready. And to your point, I think that's an example of, yeah, depending on the situation across different communities, there are going to be different strength profiles that you need to lead in different contexts. And so we're starting to do a lot of work around how do we use data to really benchmark different people's strengths, And then over time, how might we be able to match that to context to help people really find the place where they can have the biggest impact in their leadership?
All right, we're starting to run low on time already, and I know it feels like we just got started to me anyway, but this thing you just mentioned a second ago, I want to see if we can take a few minutes on before we have to close up of identifying data points that might help you understand this person could evolve into a role here that could be really helpful. If they've already gotten to principal,
Yeah.
okay. What about the people that don't ever see themselves taking those leadership roles on? Is there an earlier stream intervention that is more, I mean, even further back in the systemic change thing of, that teacher could lead, but maybe there's all kinds of reasons that nobody's ever asked them and they've never thought about it.
Yeah, for sure. And so when we talk about superintendents in Texas, so Texas is really big if you have
Hmm.
not heard.
I've heard.
And there's 1,200 school districts, and 300 of those are bigger than 5,000 students, which is considered like a small to mid-size district here. In a lot of places, that's like the biggest school district
Hmm.
in the state. And we're really focused on those larger systems. So the bulk of those are like 20,000, 30,000, fifty
Hmm.
thousand students. And so in a lot of those bigger districts, it's 8, 10, 12 years between being a principal and being the superintendent. Um, and so for us, that's reaching pretty far back in the pipeline to try to identify people early. Now, once we get really good at doing that, we definitely want to find, those high potential teachers who have leadership capacity and make sure that they're not opting out of leadership. But for now, we're starting with we think principal might be where people are starting to make decisions um, about whether or not they would be open to a career as a superintendent. And so we want to get those folks and try to encourage and cultivate them. And then, yeah, we'll keep working further back to find all the talented folks that are in our schools and could do good things for our kids.
Yeah, I think one of the bigger challenges I see in most nonprofit sectors is the um, people that maybe don't think of themselves as systems change elements. They just don't view themselves that way until somebody else comes in and says, this could be a path for you. And almost all the time when I've done that with people that I've seen in nonprofits, I'm like, you could be in a leadership role, you could be making this kind of change. The first reaction is like, you've got to be kidding me. There is just no way. And I'm like, oh no, I see it. You're just way too far from it. I've seen other people that have been on your path and you haven't seen it yet. That responsibility to step in and just help them get the idea is challenging. So I appreciate that, the process that you're working through to get a little further out there. But boy, that systems change person that is early career and they don't know it yet, that's a gem, but boy, finding them sometimes.
Yeah. And the way the system works, it is often the tap on the shoulder, which I
No.
mean, yeah, we all need to do more to encourage people, but we have all this research too that we tend to notice people as having potential for leadership who are more similar to us, so
Yeah.
it's a flawed method, which is why for us trying to figure out how we start using data. So we have this really cool, the team's built this really cool effort where we bring in people for a couple of days. They go through some like simulations and experiences that model what it's like to be a superintendent. And then we're able to say to people, I don't know if you see it, but you have a lot of characteristics that could make you really great at this. And so we're able to collect data and use data to encourage people. So we think we can kind of supplement and fill in some of the gaps of that tap on the shoulder system. Because it's true, a lot of the people who honestly, if we could have more people leading organizations who didn't sit around thinking that they wanted to lead organizations, we'd
Right.
probably those are the people we want to be in leadership roles because they tend to not be focused on themselves and their ego, and they tend to be focused on others, focused on the work, and so helping those people see the potential that they have. There's so much opportunity there.
And more to talk about and no time to do it in this time. But we will have a link to the Holsworth Center in the show notes for people that want to learn more about what your work is and how that's kind of moving along. So if you're listening on your phone right now, just go to the show notes, click through, you'll be able to see more about it. Dr. Lindsay Whorton is the Holsworth Center president. And thank you so much for taking the time to be here today.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Thanks for the conversation.